state issue. It's a community issue. It's a school level issue. It's a district issue. Principals, superintendents, individual teachers, legislators, parents, community members, community leaders, we all have these responsibilities to this problem. Some of the challenges that we see with teacher turnover are really not teacher turnover problems. They're actually symptoms of other problems that also play into teacher turnover. And sometimes fixing one part of the problem actually creates a problem in another area. So I think that there's not going to be any simple solution or silver bullet, but we look at all of these things and we all do what we can in the areas where we have influence to try and move the needle in the correct direction.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Dr. Dayna DeFeo, who is the director of the Center for Alaska Education Policy Research and a research assistant professor at the Institute for Social and Economic Research, otherwise known as ISER, at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Dr. DeFeo's primary research interests include college and post-secondary transitions, particularly in career and technical fields for underrepresented populations. But today, we will discuss another primary interest of hers, teacher turnover. Dr. DeFeo has authored several papers on this subject and is one of the authorities in our state to speak on this issue. Before we get started, though, I just wanted to mention a recent news item that appeared after I interviewed Dr. DeFeo. A report was supposed to be published in this month's edition of Alaska Economic Trends magazine. That report from the Alaska Department of Labor and Workforce Development was entitled, Teachers Shrinking Wage Advantage. Alaska used to pay the most, but now we are 10th. I will drop a link to that report in the show notes so you can read the whole thing. But for now, I'm going to read a bit of the start of the article since it is so relevant to the topic of today's episode. Quote, in the 1980s and 90s, Alaska had a distinct competitive advantage when recruiting teachers. In addition to offering natural beauty, recreation, and adventure, Alaska had the highest average salary in the country for K-12 teachers. In 1980, Alaska teachers made 170% of the national average for teachers, which made recruiting easy despite the higher cost of living and sometimes the adjustment to remote rural life. In the decades since, Alaska has fallen closer to the national average, while some states have increased their teacher pay in comparison. End quote. And now for the interview. Dayna DeFeo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Did I say your name right?
You did.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up?
I actually grew up outside of Washington, D.C. in a town called Prince George's County, Maryland, and that's where I went to high school.
And did you always know that you wanted to be a researcher in education?
No, I don't even know when that came to be. As an undergraduate student, I studied Spanish. I was very interested in language and culture, and I think when I first thought about teaching is I moved to New Mexico, and I was working in the nonprofit world doing early intervention under IDEA Part C, which are the special education services that are provided to kids before they even get into preschool. And I got that job not because I knew a lot about teaching or kids, but because I could speak Spanish. And so I did that for a couple of years and ended up being asked to teach a Spanish class at night at the local community college. And that's when I really became interested in education. And so I went back and did a master's and then a doctorate in education.
And how did you end up in Alaska?
I worked at New Mexico State University while I was doing my doctorate. And as I was finishing that, my partner and I were both at a crossroads in our careers where we could stay where we were for another 10 years, or we could look to move together. And his position, he works for the National Park Service as a hydrologist, and his special expertise is in caves and cave exploration and cave mapping. And I was really interested in doing education work. And so national parks tend to be in very remote areas that don't have large population centers, and universities where I wanted to work tend to be in major population centers. So the Venn diagram that we put together of geographic regions where we could both be gainfully employed was not so big. We looked at Hawaii volcanoes, we looked at the Grand Canyon, but Anchorage has a regional office for the Park Service here, and that seemed to be a great fit for both of us. He had lived here in the 70s, and his dad lives in Wasilla, so it was a neat thing that we could be close to family too. And when I took the job at the University of Alaska, I had never been to the state, but I was ready for a change and an adventure, and that was 2010. Was it 2010? It was 2010. So we've been here 13 years and I'm loving it.
And you work for ISER.
That's right.
What's your title?
ISER is the Institute of Social and Economic Research, and that's at the University of Alaska Anchorage. I am a research associate professor of education policy, and I also direct the Center for Alaska Education Policy Research, which is called CAEPR, and that's the education clearinghouse for the research that ISER does. So most education stuff, we funnel it through CAEPR so that we can reach the stakeholder audience that has a particular interest in education issues.
So the reason I have you here today in the legislature right now, we have a lot of focus on education in Alaska and the need for increased funding. The major move is to increase the BSA, the base student allocation, which would be the per student amount of money that is allocated by the state to the various school districts. And I guess that kind of brings up the fact that we have a lot of school districts for our population. Can you talk a little bit about Alaska's structure as a state and the number of school districts and how that makes talking about this issue difficult?
Sure. Geez, where to start? I think that there's an issue of, when we talk about education spending, there's how much we spend and what we spend it on and what we can get for the dollars that we spend. And that's different across Alaska. $5 buys very different things in the urban centers like Anchorage than it does in some of the more rural places. And I think that if we think of the cost of living being very different across the state, we can look at the employment landscape and also being quite different. We do have over 50 school districts. We also have Mount Edgecombe High School, and each school district has its own structure, its own leadership. And when it comes to teachers, which I think is where we're going to look at the teacher landscape and the teacher workforce in Alaska, each district has a slightly different collective bargaining agreement, salary schedule, and sets of benefits and in compensation structure. There are a lot of things that are similar, and then there are many differences. And I think that's a good thing because Alaska is a very diverse state, and we wouldn't think that what works in one community would necessarily be the best approach in another. And that's something I'm always trying to think about, is balancing the policy things that need to be broad and work for everybody with the absolute need for local control that attends to the nuances that are specific.
And I believe in one of your papers, you made a recommendation that we shouldn't try to adopt any sort of single teacher salary schedule because it is such a diverse state. And one argument that we hear in the legislature is that we have too many school districts and that it's too complicated, that for a state with our population to have this many school districts and this many differences of opinions and administrative burdens doesn't make sense. But like I said, I guess this was from a study. This was from the salary and benefits schedule and teacher tenure study from 2015.
That's actually the study that brought me to ISER. I had been working for the Community and Technical College and had connected with some of the ISER researchers, and I think they knew that I really wanted to get into a more research-focused position, and I got a call saying, if you would like to work on this, we can buy out some of your time. And the next thing I knew, I was working at ISER full-time because there's so much work to do. So to the thing about having so many school districts, I won't say if that's too many or not. That's not really my place. But I will note that our geography is vast. And in states that are much smaller, land masses often have many more school districts. So we've got the 54. When we did the study in I think it was 2013 data that came out in 2015, I think that the idea with the salary schedule, two things to think about. there's a structure of the salary schedule. And most of the school districts, the vast majority in the US and Alaska, use what's called a step and lane schedule. And so it looks like a grid, and you advance, that is, you earn more by additional years of experience and also your education level. So you can move, depending on how it's set up, you can move horizontally into bigger earning brackets by getting more education. And then as you get more years of service, you also earn more. And that aligns to some really good research that says that just like anything, teachers get better with time. I am a better researcher now than I was 5 years ago because I've had experience. That makes sense to reward that. Also, if you think of many people's careers, they tend to get an entry level, some careers you get an entry level position, and then you earn more or you gain raises through promotions, a couple of promotions over the course of your career. You might climb that ladder, so to speak. But with teachers, if we want good teachers to stay in the classroom, some teachers leave the classroom for other leadership positions in ed, and that's a good thing too. But we want teachers to stay in the classroom, and it's conceivable that a good teacher might start in a classroom and still have that same job 25 or 30 years later when they retire. And of course, instead of getting these promotions over the course of their career as I've gotten, teachers tend to get raises in small increments each year. And so that's how the structure is set up. So we looked at the structure and thought there's many different ways to reward it. But then the question is, what should be the numbers in those little boxes? And when we did it, it depends on what your objective is. We were trying to create or think about, as an empirical exercise, what salary would bring a teacher into a job. And not just any teacher, good, strong, qualified teachers. We could certainly pay teachers less if we're willing to accept lower qualifications, but I don't think that's what we want for our kids either. And getting a teacher to take a job is a different compensation number than getting a teacher to stay in a job. And so we were looking at all of those things. And we know that those also would vary across Alaska. So the study definitely wasn't to say that a teacher in Anchorage should make the same as, say, a teacher in Pelican or Southeast or in the interior or anywhere. We instead were looking at the structure and a geographic multiplier that would work. But even with that, the numbers that we came up with, and this was 2015, so they're old numbers, and I don't think that we've gotten better with ed spending in that time, so they're probably out of date. We found that to achieve those objectives of bringing qualified teachers into classrooms and keeping them in the classrooms, statewide, on average, teachers were paid about 10% less than they needed to be as a statewide average. Some districts paid much below what we would have recommended they needed to pay. But also, and so there would have been an increased cost for sure. But also, we looked at the literature and said it needs to be a combination of compensation and working conditions. Another way that we can have teachers stay in jobs longer, we could pay them more, and that definitely helps, and we probably should because our models suggest we should. But also, we need to look at the other conditions that encourage teachers to stay and that drive them out of the classroom. And those are things like leadership and class size and school community relations and the school climate and environment. All of those things are places that we need to work to. So it's not just money. And so we found that and we thought, well, that's, recommends against a one-size-fits-all policy. We also really dug into the collective bargaining agreements that each district has. And it's pretty interesting the different ways that districts have structured their benefit package. And sometimes the cost of providing a benefit might be a lot less than the teacher places value on it. For example, a few extra personal leave days is a relatively low cost to a district, but a teacher might put a much higher dollar value on it than the cost to the district. And since all of those are negotiated locally and the districts pool their resources, when we looked at it, we certainly weren't going to suggest that there should be a one-size-fits-all. We see that local control and that ability to negotiate locally, it takes time, but it also tends to represent the interests of the teachers and the communities.
One issue that we hear a lot is pushback that we already pay our teachers in Alaska more than most states in the lower 48. And so this constant drumbeat that teachers aren't being paid enough, that when you look at other states, we're paying well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
A little. I haven't looked at recent numbers, and I know that especially with COVID, we've had all kinds of changes with the teacher workforce. I can say a few things about teacher compensation. First off, our models suggest that it's, however you look at it, we're not compensating well enough to attract and retain teachers at the rates that we'd like to see. Right now, the teacher supply in the nation has been termed as a crisis. We have this teacher shortage crisis. And I think that we've got two components to that. It's producing enough teachers through our education programs to work in our classrooms and keeping those teachers in the classroom. So if you look at a field like IT, if you're an IT specialist and you live in the city of Anchorage, you probably have lots and lots of places that you could go and get a job, right? You could work the private sector, the public sector, you could start your own business, you could do all these things. If you want to work as a teacher and you live in Anchorage, you have pretty much one employer if you want to be a classroom teacher. You're going to work for the Anchorage School District. That's your employer. And that's a very different labor market than a lot of other fields. And so how that drives the supply demand is different. We import the majority of our new teacher hires from the lower 48 here in Alaska. And we've seen nationally that enrollment in teacher preparation programs is down. Turnover is high. While Alaska went through its fiscal crisis in recent years, the lower 48 was experiencing a relative economic boom. And so the demand for teachers and their other states' ability to compensate teachers, they invested a lot more. Nationally, the supply is low, the demand is high, and teachers, if we want teachers to take that leap of faith, to move, especially out-of-state teachers, to move to Alaska from other places where the cost of living is higher, but it's also farther from families and all of those things, I don't think that we could expect that we would pay the same amount as another state and that we would get the same number of teachers who are able and willing to come here.
If you want somebody to move out of the lower 48 to Alaska, you're asking something that's not being asked if you're just asking somebody to move from one city to another or from one state to another. That on the road system, you can drive, it's not that far away. There has to be, I think when people say, oh, but we already pay enough, if people aren't willing to come here, then we're not paying enough.
I think the proof is in the pudding, and it's not only pay, right? It's also working conditions and all that goes with it. But if we had the right special sauce, we wouldn't have the challenges. There are going to be challenges regardless. Teacher turnover is what's been described as a wicked problem, and meaning that it's just so complex. No solution is going to be straightforward. It's not even a problem that we can, I'm using air quotes, solve. We can make it better with policy. We can make it worse, but we can set some targets, but there won't be an obvious point where we're like, yeah, we've solved that problem. This issue is characterized by distributed responsibility. This is a state issue. It's a community issue. It's a school level issue. It's a district issue. Principals, superintendents, individual teachers, legislators, parents, community members, community leaders, we all have these responsibilities to this problem. Some of the challenges that we see with teacher turnover are really not teacher turnover problems. They're actually symptoms of other problems that also play into teacher turnover. And sometimes fixing one part of the problem actually creates a problem in another area. So I think that there's not going to be any simple solution or silver bullet, but we look at all of these things and we all do what we can in the areas where we have influence to try and move the needle in the correct direction.
I interviewed a teacher who's 50 years in the classroom. 50.
Wow.
And she started her career in Texas. And she said when she made the decision to become a teacher, she knew she wasn't going to be wealthy. That she knew that no one goes in America, in 1973 or whatever, no one took that job to become a wealthy person. But she knew that she would be taken care of in retirement. That was super important. And so I think you've mentioned that it's not just about pay, it's also about benefits. And I guess the impossible question is, which is more important? Which is the part that we really need to be paying attention to? When I think that what she mentioned, I think is still true today. I don't think there aren't that many folks who go into teaching careers because they want to be wealthy.
I don't know. I didn't go into a teaching career. I can tell you I didn't go into working as a public employee to be wealthy, but I like what I do. But I also think it's dangerous to say people find the job so rewarding and that should be enough. I think that we also need to make sure that it's great if you can love your job and if you can find it rewarding, but you're also worth a tremendous amount if you're working with kids and investing your time in the health and future of our communities and our state. Sure, there are jobs that pay better than others, but I don't think that the commitment and disposition teachers have, we shouldn't. I know you.
Well, I was the point that she was making is that Alaska, by not having the current retirement package, is not attractive compared to somebody working in Texas, for example, as she used as a comparison, that a teacher today with the defined contribution plan as opposed to the defined benefit plan, that there's just no way that someone would make the decision that she made to move from Texas to Alaska if they were going to give up what was being taken care of in retirement to a much riskier plan in Alaska.
No, I hear what you're saying. That is a tricky question. So I'll answer it from a researcher perspective. And so for listeners who might be less familiar, was it 2007 that the state of Alaska...
We voted, I think.
Pardon me?
I think 2006 was the vote, but it happened in 2007.
Yeah, so we've got a cohort of teachers who, if you were hired in 2006, you had effectively a pension. And if you were hired in 2007, you were on a defined contribution plan, which would be like what we would know as a 401k. And so a big question has been, what has that done to our ability to attract and retain teachers? And that's a great question. I think that it's a complicated question. So I work at the Institute of Social and Economic Research. So an economist goes, that's actually a great sort of experiment to do, is you could look at the teachers we hired in 2006 and the ones we hired in 2007 and look at their retention outcomes. Now's a good time to do a study like that because you have to have enough time between the policy change and people to actually make decisions and do stuff before you start to look in and start measuring stuff. But now it's been
17 years.
Yeah, not quite 20 years. But I mean, we're at the point where these teachers are really in that late stage of their career where retirement is on the horizon, and it's probably driving their decisions a lot more than it did after 2 years in the classroom. So it's a great experiment in that way. The other thing is lots of things are drawing teachers out of Alaska. So we brought a lot of teachers up in 2008 because there was all that happened in the lower 48 with the housing market and whatnot. So we were a relatively good place to work then. Then the lower 48 had its economic boom while we had a fiscal crisis. So the market conditions for that 2006 and 2007 cohort, the things that would bring them here or pull them away, they were largely experiencing the same thing as early career professionals in that time and throughout their time here. So it's good to compare those two groups, see what happened, and see if that policy seems to have affected their decisions to stay and work in Alaska. I also think...
Do we have that? Do we know what happened?
We certainly could do that analysis.
Okay, but it hasn't been done.
No. ISER has been asked a couple of times what it would take to do that analysis, and I think we're very excited about doing it, but we haven't looked deeply. And I think that you don't want to just straight up look at numbers. I think you want to do a lot more controls and modeling there, but that is something that we could do. But as a policy person, I also think to myself, that was 2006. Another interesting question is, were the policies of the past and behaviors of people in the past the best way to design policy for the future? So people that we hired in, the teacher you talked about was a boomer. I'm a Gen Xer. Then we have millennials. We have Gen Z. So we have all of these different generations of workers who it's not just teaching in the state of Alaska that have changed their pension and retirement options. We've seen lots of changes between these generations and very different ways that these generations, their work patterns are quite different. I know my dad and his generation, he got a job and worked for that same entity until he retired. I don't think that's the norm for many people coming into the workforce now. And so I think it would be great to look at those two cohorts. But I was talking with Dr. Mike Jones, who was on your study or on your podcast not too long ago, to also look at that through some other economic experiments. He would call them a choice experiment, where we look at how different generations might think differently about these things. And our job is to generate information to help us understand the issues and to pass that on as well as we can to people in your position and to citizens and the community who can take that information and use it to make decisions. I know that the union and the teachers union and the Alaska leadership groups, they work with teachers every day. They have this on the ground experience. They're talking to teachers, and that tells a very different story, a very important story that our numbers don't always reflect. And so I think it's a combination of the information we can provide through research, but also listening to constituents and talking with teachers and the groups that represent teachers and who work with teachers and who see it day in, day out. So I hope that we can help to inform that conversation. I'd love to do that study with my colleagues.
I think to flesh it out, what I heard was that this teacher who'd been in the classroom for 50 years, if you go back to 1973, there were many industries that provided their workers with some sort of pension. Mm-hmm. Maybe younger people don't think about the pension in the same way that someone who's 65 or 70 years old might think about it.
I just think that the landscape is a little bit different. And I, of course, want what's best for teachers. We look at compensation, and that is maybe part of the trade-off is the stability that brings more people into the profession. There's so many things to think about. I'm just saying that what people did in the past and what people valued
may
from
not be the
different
best
generations.
Indicator of what they'll do in the future.
Yeah. So I think a really thoughtful and collaborative solution that's informed by the people who we ultimately want to reach, attract, and retain is the way to go. I can give you some numbers if I do some research, but ultimately, I think that the institutions that represent teacher interests know the best. I do want to talk a little bit, too, though, about another benefit that factors into teacher salaries, and it's health insurance and healthcare. When we've looked just recently, we've been going over healthcare costs and collective bargaining agreements across the school districts in Alaska. That is a huge expense for districts, huge, to provide health insurance to teachers. And looking at that, Alaska has, this is Dr. Gutabi's work, the highest per capita healthcare costs in the nation. If we're paying teachers and part of their pay is a benefit, I'm not saying that we have better healthcare benefits than other school districts, but we pay more for them. And if we're in a fixed budget situation where we have to pay for health care, because that's a benefit that every district provides and that teachers surely expect that they would get health care, in a fixed budget situation, the high costs of health care and other things put downward pressure on wages. And when we look at the teacher's total compensation, that's the sum total of the money they take home, but also all of the benefits that they have. Healthcare we spend a lot there, but I think that what teachers are getting is, I haven't looked into it, but I don't think that they're getting a much better health package than they get in most other school districts, but it costs us more. And so that's another part of teacher compensation that's just a reality of Alaska. Like I said, it's a wicked problem, this whole issue. It's not really a teacher turnover problem, healthcare costs, but they certainly factor into the teacher turnover issues.
I definitely want to do an episode about the cost of healthcare in Alaska. So I will have more ISER folks on.
So, and I am not a health economist, but I work with some exceedingly bright and informed healthcare economists. But from working with them and looking at the cost of these benefit packages, it costs a lot for us to provide teachers with the same benefits that other districts have.
I want to shift gears a little bit. One thing that that folks talk a lot about is outcomes and what is a glib slogan is, we'll pay more when the outcomes improve, or that sort of line of thinking that we need, that if students are doing this badly, our schools are failing us this much, how could they possibly expect us to reward them with additional money? And I guess from our brief email correspondence, I think one of the issues is that how we measure outcomes has changed a lot over the past 40 years. And so it's very difficult to talk about differences in outcomes when you're constantly changing the way you're measuring the outcome.
Sure. Two things there. I'm just going to make a note here. I will say that we all want good outcomes for our kids. What we invest in education it truly is an investment, and it's associated with all kinds of social conditions that we'd like to see, healthier kids, communities, families, in so many ways. It is true that we could pay a lot more and potentially not have better outcomes, but the other side of that is I don't think it's reasonable to say that we could invest less and get better. And it's really, I think, an issue of making sure that we are adequately investing in education and looking at what those dollars go to, making sure that we're spending them in the right places and on the right things.
What's the wrong places? What's the potential wrong places that money could go?
Oh, I don't know that I'm prepared to say. Let me think on that for a sec.
Because I think that's the crux of the matter. The fear is that if we double the BSA or raise it to over $1,000 or whatever we ultimately do, and there is a lot more money going to the school districts, I think there's fear from folks that the money will be wasted and that it won't actually improve outcomes, which is what we want to see. We want students to do better.
So I guess maybe I'm not comfortable talking about the wrong places. I can come up with an example.
Okay.
A couple of years ago, a lot more went into schools. I can't remember the year. Also, energy costs went through the roof. And we have to heat our schools. We have to have the lights on. In cold places, you have to put more energy into them. But we could essentially be paying a lot more just to keep the building heated and lit, but really not having anything better, right? Because the cost of doing that goes up. So there are some things that are fixed costs, like we have to heat buildings, we have to light buildings, we have to bring internet connections into communities and schools. All of those things cost, and the drivers of those costs are really outside of ed policy, but districts need to spend those. And so then it's a question of what's left over. I think that when we did that salary study in 2015, it was part of an omnibus education bill, and the bill also called for an adequacy study to say, for a minute, let's just put aside the cost of these things. What do we need? And to frame these education questions in terms of how many teachers in school buildings, and what do you need? And then we can figure out how much they cost, but to start with the actual input rather than the dollars. And the state has not yet done one of those studies. And I think that would potentially be, I would say that would be one of the most informative things, is to use the evidence base to figure out what we need to buy, and then we can figure out how much it costs. But by talking about the dollars first rather than what we're going to buy with those dollars, I think puts the cart before the horse. And I know that's probably how it works in the legislature, but it could be much better informed if we put if
we knew exactly what we needed and then figured out how much that cost. And then we had, rather than throwing out numbers and then figuring out what they would pay for.
Exactly. Because what they buy changes year to year. Fuel costs fluctuate so much, energy costs, and they differ between districts too. From year to year, they change, and even district to district, what they pay for their units is different. Schools don't benefit from power cost equalization.
I was going to say, I just learned that today. Right. I'm sure I'm not the only person listening to this podcast right now who did not know that power cost equalization doesn't apply to schools, which that just seems weird. That we are charging the school, like the schools have to pay. Yeah, I can't really rationalize that.
And I don't know why, but I can say that's certainly driving the costs in rural communities of the costs of operating and maintaining buildings. And if schools are having to pay for power, then those are dollars that are not going into instructional activities and teaching and learning. But kids need to be in warm buildings. There's no doubt about it. And so some of those things are these fixed costs. And then it's what's left over. Where do you have wiggle room after you've paid for the things that are non-negotiables? I'm not an ed finance person, but that is something that we see as a huge driver of the cost, the per pupil spending costs in Alaska. We see healthcare as one, small schools as one, and also the cost of fuel.
What about class size? And that this is obviously more of an Anchorage urban large district issue. Is that one way that they balance their budget, so to speak, is if we lose this amount of money, then we can only afford this number of teachers, which means class sizes have to go from being 26 students per class on average to 28 or some sort of calculation like that. And I don't know the research on what is the optimal class size and how much does increasing a class size adversely affect student outcomes.
It's a pretty complicated question. I couldn't answer it with research, but I could say the optimal class size for kindergartners is very different than the optimal class size for middle schoolers or high schoolers. How many kids it's safe to have, say, in a high school CTE welding class is very different, say, than maybe a class where students are working with paper. Also, in a lot of our smaller communities, we have multi-grade rooms. Teachers are certified to teach multiple subjects. The number of youth in the classrooms who need special support, students who have IEPs, students who are receiving other services, all of that drives. But generally speaking, smaller class sizes are good for students and for learning. But an optimal number, I don't think that you could make a blanket statement. It would want to take into account all of the different factors. That's one of the things an adequacy study looks at is the number of teachers you need in a school, the number of teachers' aides. If you have a teacher's aide, you can have a larger classrooms. Jobs have changed over time too. They look at support staff for students who have IEPs. They look at support staff and extra tutors for students who are needing additional support. It really varies on a lot of student and community characteristics and classroom characteristics. I think that the adequacy study that I've suggested takes into account a lot of those considerations and indicates what would be enough, what would be good based on the latest research. And it won't be the same in every community or every school.
When we talk about teacher turnover, I'm going to make some generalizations and then you can correct me.
Sure.
I would guess that poorer schools have a higher rate of turnover than richer schools. That in Alaska, the wealthier urban schools would have the lowest rate of turnover, and the poorest urban schools would have the highest rate of turnover. And then I would think that the poorest rural villages would have the highest rate of turnover. I'm just generalizing that not all schools are created equally when it comes to teacher turnover. And how do we address that?
I'm actually working on a project to look at that right now, to look at equitable compensation. Anchorage is an interesting example because I live in Anchorage, I live in Eagle River. Talking about that step and lane salary schedule that I talked before, how much you would make as a teacher in Anchorage, regardless of what school you work in, would be determined by your number of years of experience and your level of education. So in Anchorage, conceivably, you could work at any school. You could drive and not have to move, as opposed to, say, working in a rural community. If you decide this isn't the school for me, I'm going to move, you are relocating. You are moving to a new geographic place. In Anchorage, it's an interesting situation because teachers can vote with their feet. You get hired into the school district and then you can go to the places that you prefer. And in all school districts in the U.S., saying all, few researchers will say all the time, but consistently across research, we see teachers moving from lower income, higher minority schools to higher income, whiter schools. That's a trend that we see. And so we go, what are the reasons for that? And some really interesting work from Linda Darling-Hammond, Controlling for a Lot of Characteristics. It's not the kids. Teachers like the kids. We can see that also associated with low-income schools, and not as a rule, but making generally, lower-income schools are characterized by not as good school leadership. That is definitely associated with teacher turnover, poorer working conditions, toilets that flush, evidence of rodents, having enough desks, having enough books, having the technology that you want to use to teach the kids, up-to-date teaching materials. Often lower income schools in Anchorage, we don't have this issue because we have the one salary schedule here, but across the U.S., they also tend to pay less. Has to do in part with the tax bracket, and local taxes in Anchorage or in Alaska are very different than they are in the lower 48, but in the lower 48 where they can tax communities, property taxes, higher income areas have higher money going to the schools. All of these things, we definitely see teachers moving from lower income schools to higher income schools. That is turnover at the school level. Teacher might stay in the profession, but they're leaving one school, taking a different job. But we see that connected very often to working conditions and compensation. And how do you equalize that? How do you provide equity through policy is something that my team and I are working on to really better flesh out and understand right now.
Anecdotally, you hear about new teachers who'll talk about the school that they were assigned to start with. It's not even an issue of, I guess that is the issue of the teacher turnover, is that you're going to have brand new teachers. In other words, the only teachers who are assigned to the quote worst schools are the brand new teachers, because the teacher with experience who has a little bit more say in where they're going to teach is not going to choose to go to the quote worst school. They'll want to teach at a better school. And so it's like a teacher does a couple of years at the quote worst school, and then they have enough seniority to be able to take a spot at a more desirable school. And so you're always having the brand new teachers, who, as you said earlier, when you've been teaching for 10 years, you're better than when you started. The more you do it, the better you get. So we have the worst teachers at the quote worst schools. Maybe not those words, but
yeah, those aren't the words I would use. I would say that you tend to have less experienced teachers in lower income schools. They're not bad schools by any means, but they are schools that are characterized by poorer working conditions, for sure. One thing that we do see is another thing is that in high minority schools, it takes a little bit longer for teachers to learn communities if they're not from that community, if they're not from that culture, if they don't have that linguistic background. So it's easier for a teacher to step in and teach a group of kids that they have a lot in common with. And so when we bring teachers into communities who are not familiar with language, culture, customs, it takes a little longer for them to be as effective as someone who is.
And by the time they gain that knowledge, they might move to a different school.
They might. We really do see that teachers of color tend to stay in teaching positions working with students of color, and they're very effective there. And some teachers really do choose to stay in particular school settings that might be characterized by poor working conditions because they fit there, and that's okay too. Our models are looking at how to encourage teachers to take those jobs and to stay and to compensate them fairly. And I think I've got my hands making a scale, if you will. If you improve working conditions, then you can actually pay less. It's a balance of optimizing working conditions and pay. But the worse the working conditions are, the more pay you have to make up for them. And if working conditions are great, teachers and they're happy in the job, they're willing to take less money for a job that they really enjoy. So it's finding that right balance. We want them to both be optimized, but we understand that the working conditions are driving a lot of the turnover decisions. And that's workload too. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Workload. How much time you have to prep. If you are the senior teacher in a school that has a lot of turnover, are you constantly mentoring the new teachers? That's taxing on you. It takes you away from your students. So the workload also can be very high. Are you doing lunch duty instead of doing prep? And then are you taking that work home? All of those things. We all do extra duties as assigned, but after a while, those wear on our teacher burnout is a true concern.
There was an area of your 2015 salary and benefits study about tenure. Can you talk about what teacher tenure means in the public school system? Because I think we assume that it means that they can never be fired.
So it's a very good misconception to start with. And I wish I had read that paper a little closer to this conversation. It's been a while, but yes. So the teacher tenure in the K-12 system is different from tenure at the university systems. Even though they have the same name and they're both in education, tenure in K-12 effectively, and I wish I could quote this.
I have it. You wrote that it's due process.
Effectively, yes. So a lot of times if you're a public employee and you're brought into a job, you're on a probationary period where your employment is at will and you can be let go for kind of any reason. And most public employees, I know when I was staff before I moved into faculty, I think it was like 6 months, that they're like, this is a trial. And if it doesn't work out, we have the right to let you go.
For any reason.
As I understand it, yeah. Obviously, they can't discriminate, but just say, hey, this isn't working out. So most public employees have a 6-month probationary period. For teachers, it's actually a 3-year period. And after that, it says that if you're going to be fired, there needs to be cause, that you have the right to try and improve. But you can also be laid off for budget reasons. It doesn't protect teachers against that. It does give you a little bit of seniority of moving into another job if your position is being eliminated. For example, if you're teaching a subject that the district decides we're not going to have that program anymore and you're qualified, you have some seniority to move into another job. So it doesn't protect against layoffs. It doesn't protect against firing for cause, but it's due process. And the benefit, I think, of tenure for teachers is teachers are advocates for kids and families, and teachers need to do the right thing for students. They need to be able to stand up to influential parents. They need to be able to stand up to leaders who might, and I don't want to say any, but to leadership policies or practices that they think might not be in a kid's best interest. And they need to feel safe to do that and to not lose their job. It offers teachers just the protection to advocate for themselves and for their colleagues and for students and families and teaching and learning, and some safety, some job security that goes along with it. Most states in the U.S. have tenure, although it was popular around the time when we did that study to take away tenure as a benefit. Teachers place a lot of value on that benefit, and it is something that most other states offer. If we were to take away those protections, I think we would want to think about what teachers wouldn't be able to do in terms of advocating, which is really important. But our model also shows we'd have to pay teachers a lot more to take on that risk when they could go to another state and feel more adequately protected. Tenure is something that teachers value, and because we provide it, our recommendation is if you take away tenure, you're going to have to pay teachers a lot more if you want them to stay at the same rate that we see them staying now, because they have many other options.
We only have a few minutes left, and I feel like my notes are all in disarray. You've been working on this subject for 10 years here. What do you want people to take away?
I am just amazed at the work that teachers and principals in our schools do. They work so very hard. During COVID, I think we saw very unusual and unexpected amounts of, I've been asked a lot about how is COVID going to affect our teacher workforce. COVID is also a very interesting ed spending question, making us very hard for us to look at ed spending in Alaska, because those COVID years when we weren't busing kids at the same rate and when we had all of this extra income from federal dollars was coming in, it remains to be seen how that event will affect our teacher workforce in terms of people who are going through teacher training programs during COVID who might not have had the chance to student teach, people who were in their first and second years of teaching, which are known to be the toughest ones. And if you're doing that during COVID, people who had to take on a variety of different things. But the more I work with teachers and education leadership across this country, but especially in this state, they're doing amazing work. And I'm privileged to try and work in service of those individuals. And I'm always going to advocate for policies that bring the best, strongest teachers into our schools. And I hope that our listeners also think of how they can thank and support teachers in their communities and through the policies that you're working on and supporting those too.
Last question is if somebody's interested in learning more about these issues, are there any books out there or a book that people could pick up?
Tons of books, but I would actually say the ISER, all of the work that ISER does is available free of charge on our website. We've got all kinds of resources. We write books, but we also have short little 2-pagers that explain policy issues. If you go to iseralaska.org, you can click on the publications. You can put my name in there, or education or healthcare, whatever it is, and those are all available. I also subscribe to Education Week. There are lots of periodicals that come out that summarize ed issues. Education Commission of the States also puts out every day sort of an overview of what's happening with education in the U.S., and I find those to be great resources. Sometimes Alaska pops up in there. We were there this week looking at some of the great work that Barb Adams did with the teacher recruitment and retention group that she led. That made the national What's Going On in the States blog. They picked four things. So sometimes you can read about Alaska, but you can also see what other states are doing. And I think when you look at it, that Alaska has some unique challenges, but we're grappling with the same questions that many other states are grappling with. I think we have to think about it all through an Alaskan lens, but I think we can also learn from what other states are doing, see what's working, and share our research as much as possible so that we can work to ensure that all kids across our country have access to an adequate and quality education.
Dr. Dayna DeFeo, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have included the links to the sites Dr. DeFeo just mentioned, as well as the link to the new teacher report from the Alaska Department of Labor and Workforce Development in this episode's show notes. Thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebbookclub@gmail.com. That's eastanchoragebbookclub, all one word, @gmail.com.